Okay, let's get started today. Today what we'd like to do is we want to basically just introduce some of the building blocks of economics, some of the basic concepts that we'll run into throughout the semester. And we also want to talk a little bit about the nature of economics. Well, what is it? And I don't mean the nature of the economy, but the nature of economic analysis, how economists go about looking at things and understanding things. First of all, what is economics? That's a good place to start. What is economics? It's the study of a few things. How people use their time and material resources to improve their well-being. Let me put in another word here, their own well-being. I don't want to make it look like somehow we are all one people trying to improve our collective well-being. I spend my money to improve my well-being. You spend your money to improve yours. Okay? By material resources, what do I mean? I mean things like money, if you have land or property, if you have capital equipment, computers, well, just whatever resources that we have at our command, and time is one of those resources, that's why I mentioned it separately, but whatever those resources that we have at our command, we use those to make ourselves better off. That's what we study in economics. A second thing that we look at, we study how those decisions, the decisions that we just talked about, how those decisions affect others in society. We study that. And then finally, we study policies designed to affect people making economic decisions. Move this so I... So we're looking at the economic decisions people are making, we're looking at the impacts those decisions have elsewhere in society, and then we're looking at policies that are designed to influence economic decisions. That's really quite a lot that we look at here. When I look at these ideas up here, this is sort of a lengthy definition. I'll come back later with a shorter definition of what do we mean by economics, and economic analysis. But when we look at all this, there's a lot of things that, at least to me, sort of come out of here. And so these are sort of the implications I draw from this. One, economics is a social science. You know, social science is one that examines human behavior. And so we can already see right here that we're talking about how people use their time and material resources. The interest there is we want to understand human behavior. Now, we're not trying to understand every aspect of human behavior. We're not interested here in how do people vote. That isn't something to do with how you use your time and material resources to make yourself better off. We're not interested in people's religious activity. That's another type of social science or behavioral science, but we don't study that about people's habits of worshiping their God and so forth. That's a different thing that we don't look at. Economics is a social science, but it just focuses on this idea of using resources to make yourself better off, to further your own well-being. A second thing that I see here is this as a concept of microeconomics. I'll underline the micro. Microeconomics is the economics of, well, micro, you get the word small from that, but of small decision-making units. We'll talk later about the macroeconomics, but what we're interested in here when we talk about microeconomics, we're talking about individuals. How individuals decide to do one thing versus another. They're trying to improve their own well-being, they're using their time and material resources, but these are individuals, not groups. Okay? So, when we talk about individuals that are buying things, consumers, we talk about individuals that are going to work as an employee. We're talking about individuals that start a business or manage a business. We're talking in these cases about microeconomic behavior. And I see microeconomics in here when it says how people use their time and material resources. We're talking about individual people. We'll come back later and talk more about macroeconomics, but macroeconomics is the collection of everybody, or pretty much everybody. I don't see a lot of that right here in this beginning part. I see it more down here later on, and we'll come back to that. A third thing I see that is important that I want to point out to you is that behavior is motivated by self-interest. Now, I do not mean to tell you that all behavior is motivated by self-interest. I don't mean to say everybody's selfish and just grabbing more for themselves and take it away from others. But I'm saying that economic behavior, the kind of behavior we will try and understand in this class and other economics classes, that is self-interested behavior. It is behavior where the person's saying, I would like to get a better price on that product I'm buying. I would like to earn more money. I would like to have a higher rate of return on my investments. I would like to locate in the south side of town rather than the north side of town for my business because that's where I think I'll have the most customers. Economic behavior is self-interested behavior. And part of understanding and catching on to economics as a field of study is to always sort of have this in the back of your mind, is that we're looking at people who are self-interested. And once you understand that motivation in economic decisions, it's a lot easier to understand those decisions, how they come about. A fourth thing that I see in all this is that economic decisions, how about economic decisions have a broader impact that extends beyond the individual. I mentioned over here that, that those decisions that people make, those economic decisions people make, they have a broader impact. For example, I could make an economic decision. There's two cars out here. I could buy one car. I could buy the other car. The first car, it's inexpensive and creates a lot of pollution. And the other car is more expensive. It creates a lot less pollution. And then if I'm looking out for myself, what I say is, gosh, this car that's less expensive, yeah, it might create more pollution, but so what? That pollution is going to be behind me. I'm going to be moving down the road. I'll buy that car, the one that's going to cost me less. So my decision in this particular case is going to have a broader impact. It's going to cause pollution in this particular instance. If I decide, let's say, to change jobs, then my deciding to change jobs, it will affect other people. It may cause somebody else to lose their job. Maybe there's somebody else who's applying for a job. I apply for it. If I get the job, they don't get it. Or maybe somebody else, they fire them in order to hire me. If I decide I want to sell something, maybe I have a garage sale, I get some old lawnmowers out of the garage and put them out there, I sell some lawnmowers. Maybe what that means is somebody buys my lawnmower, they don't go over to the hardware store and buy a lawnmower there. It affects the hardware store's ability to sell their product or the pricing that they can get for their product. Economic decisions, when we make those decisions and act on them, then it has impacts that go beyond that. Another thing is, my decision, your decision, that could affect the overall economic conditions. And I'm going to say, it's been a while since I've checked into this, but about 2/3 to 70%, someplace 65 or 70% of SMS students come from beyond Greene County. Probably 2/3. beyond Greene County. So what that means is that people who are from outside of Greene County, St. Louis or Kansas City or elsewhere in the state, when you come to Springfield and go to school, then you bring money with you. Your economic decision where to go to school, it brought money into the city of Springfield. And so now maybe once or twice a week you go up to the grocery store here on the corner and you buy some groceries. When you buy the groceries, the grocery store owner says, wow, we've got a lot of customers in here. Let's hire some employees. Let's order up some, cheese that's produced over at the Kraft plant. Let's order up some milk that's, I don't know where they pasteurize the milk, someplace here in town, Mid-America Dairymen or whatever. So the point is your decision to come to Springfield to go to college has brought money into our economy, and your decision then has affected the state of economic conditions in Springfield, Missouri. People's decision to move to the United States from overseas, that brings economic activity into the United States. Somebody's decision to go overseas or to invest overseas, those economic decisions have an impact on foreign economies or on the U.S. economy. This is where, and I'm sort of talking about broader economic conditions here, this is where the subject of macroeconomics comes up, and I'll just kind of mention that. Macro, of course, is big. It's that part of the economy where we're talking about the overall state of economic conditions. So our economic decisions, they have macroeconomic effects. Now, we won't notice those macroeconomic effects if just one person does something. If, let's say I take all the money out of my checking account and put it in a coffee can and bury it in a hole 10 feet deep in my backyard. Now, that will have some macroeconomic effects. There will be a little less money circulating in the economy, and that will have its effects. But one person with the small amount of money I have, that wouldn't be noticeable. But the point is that my decision to do that, your decision to do the same thing, that would have impacts on the overall economic conditions in the United States. And the final thing that I see here is that government policies sometimes affect economic activity. Well, why would that be? Why would the government have these policies that to affect economic activity? And the answer is, gosh, we've talked about a lot of the reasons. For example, maybe I make a decision or take a decision to buy this polluting car, and maybe other people don't like that. They see this smoke, this cloud following me down the highway, and people say, man, I'm coughing, I'm sneezing, this stuff is getting on my car, it's terrible. Enough voters tell the government that, and then the government comes out and they say something like, okay, we're going to regulate pollution on these cars. And cars that have pollution above a certain threshold, get them off the road, either repair them or junk them. So the government will take actions to affect economic activity. If they say junk these cars, let's say junk all the cars over 10 years old, then what we're going to see is we're going to see the older cars going off the road. That will create a demand for newer cars, and then economic activity in Detroit and other places where cars are manufactured, that will pick up. So the fact that some of our decisions affect other people, that is one of the reasons that the government gets involved in the economy. They don't like the decisions we make. They, government officials, policymakers, they may not like the decisions we make. Government officials didn't think, what would it be, 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, they didn't think that people were saving enough for their retirement. So what the government did about 60 years ago is they started up the Social Security system, and they said, hey, you weren't saving enough on your own, so what we're going to do is we're going to just take some money out of your paycheck. It's mandatory. You have no choice. Before the money gets to you, we're going to take it away from you, and we're going to put that away for your retirement. That was still when they were keeping that fiction going that they were putting something away for our retirement. But the point is that if we don't make decisions that government officials would think are appropriate, we're affecting others in society, and the government officials would come along and try to correct things. Now, they could be wrong, and I'm not saying everything the government does is right, but the point is that's what they are thinking, is that those people made the wrong decisions that had effects that we don't like, and so what we'll do is we'll correct those decisions. Oh, people smoke too many cigarettes. Government officials may think, what we ought to do is put a tax on cigarettes. That will discourage smoking. Yes, it will. And it will also have an impact on the economies of Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina. I mean, each thing in the economy is hooked to something else. You know, as every business has got employees, and so if you affect the business, you affect the employees. And then if you affect the employees, that might affect how much they can afford to spend at the end of the month. So if you affect the business, which affects the employees, it affects the employees' spending. Maybe it will affect where the employee sends their children to college, and so forth. So there's a lot of interdependence within the economy. All in all, what we're talking about here is a set of pretty powerful forces. As I mentioned last time, we live in an economic world. Now, there's politics out in that world, and there's religion, and there's other things there. There's family, but we live in a world that is increasingly an economic one. We are becoming more closely tied to Europe, elsewhere in Latin America, Asia. So it's an interdependent world where there's trade taking place. There's huge amounts of money involved. Economic activity in Springfield, new production of goods and services in Springfield, let's say Greene County, will be on the order of $6 billion a year, maybe $7 billion a year. That's a big amount of money, but it's just 1/1000th of the overall United States economy. We're talking trillions of dollars for the United States economy. So we're talking about powerful forces. We're talking about things that are more and more common as time goes by. And so it's necessary, really, for us to have some understanding of how the economy operates. Okay. The one I want to build on right here, this idea, is that behavior is motivated by self-interest. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. First thing to keep in mind is this, that economic decisions get made by individuals, not by groups, not by organizations. You know, that sounds kind of obvious. Who even needs to point it out? But sometimes it's kind of easy to forget that. It's kind of easy to say they do this or they do that, you know, and sort of get it in our mind that there's some collective meeting of people up here and they're all getting together and make decisions. Now, you know, if we wanted to have some kind of a deal here to decide on where to set the thermostat, we wouldn't all agree on that. And people don't all agree on almost anything. They all agree on they don't want to be killed by a nuclear bomb right now. We could all get together on that. But the point is that economic decisions are made by individuals. Maybe I want to live on the north side of town, you want to live on the south side of town. We don't all have to agree. We just go our own separate ways. But then those individuals who are making the decisions, those individuals, we're saying, are self-interested. Individuals are self-interested. This is in their economic decisions. And now, I don't mean to say that individuals are always self-interested. It may be that you work very hard, save your money, look out only for yourself when you're, let's say, selling your labor services. You bargain for the highest wage you can get. When it's time to go to the store, maybe you clip the coupons out of the paper and go to the stores that have the lowest price and just try to get the best bargain you can. And you build up that savings account month after month after month. And then you may decide to give that to your church or to give it to some charitable organization. And that's perfectly okay. We're not saying that people are always self-interested, but when they are interacting within the economy, they are self-interested. They are making decisions based on this idea of self-interest. However, we don't make these decisions, these self-interested economic decisions, we don't make those in a vacuum. We go out there into the real world. And when we're out in the real world, then our decisions are constrained. Babies don't know that. Babies will just pitch a fit and cry and so forth if they don't get what they want. If they feel like it's time to be fed and there's not, that bottle of milk right there in their mouth, then they start crying. And I'm a little bit that way also. Not with respect to milk, which I don't like, but I need to have my way. Anyway, the point is, though, out there in the real world, we don't just say, well, I'm self-interested, whatever I want's what I get. We have to deal with, really with some constraints that are imposed on us by nature. Right? Nature imposes some constraints on us. Laws impose constraints. Yes, I want to be rich, but there's a law that says I can't just get a gun and go up and down the streets and telling people to give me their money. We're constrained by technology. And I don't mean to say technology has not been improving, but what I mean to say is that whatever the state of technology is today, that's limited us in terms of what we can do. We're constrained by market conditions. And let me put in parentheses, other people. Because those are other people out there in the market, the other buyers and the other sellers that are in the marketplace. They are the ones who are constraining us. Maybe I think my labor services ought to be worth $100,000 a year, but all the other people wanting to sell economic services and all the other people wanting to buy economic services, they decide my services are worth $20,000 a year. And so I just have to live with that. So market conditions impose constraints on us. Now, here's the deal. All of these things, in one way or the other, all of these last 3 out of 4, these are somehow or another, one way or another, those are established by people. Policymakers or individuals and so forth. People control these, and so to some extent, we can bend these constraints. We can change them to some extent. And not always easily, but I just mean to say these aren't immutable. They aren't just locked in place and you just have to live with it. But this first one up here, nature, nature doesn't really care what you want. Nature just says, here's the way it works. There is gravity, and if I drop this pin, it's going to hit the floor, and we just don't have to have a negotiation over that. We don't have to wonder about it. We don't have to think, if the Congress would pass a new law, then this thing would go up when I let it go. That's just not going to happen. Unless Congress passes a law to send me into outer space. But this is the one that's the sort of hard and fast constraint, this natural constraint, and the others are to some extent changeable, flexible. Whatever these constraints are today may not be the constraints tomorrow or next year. But nature is pretty much of an unbending, unforgiving thing. Okay? So when we talk about these constraints, we tend to focus on the constraints imposed by nature. Here's one thing nature says. Let me do a little erasing here. One of the things nature says is if you want to produce goods, let's say this, put it this way, resources are required to produce goods and services. Nature says we're just not going to be giving you any free stuff, dropping it from the sky. If you want cars, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to come up with some equipment. You're going to have to come up with some raw materials out of the ground. You're going to have to come up with labor services. There's going to be some work in this. So nature is telling us resources are required to produce goods and services. I mean absolutely, unequivocally, it's always going to be that way. What do I mean by resources? Well, we've got a list of these. Productive resources. Land, I'll just give you a list and we'll go back and discuss each one. Labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Now, you can think probably of a lot of things that you say, oh, you use this or use that, you use plastic, you use glass, you use aluminum, you use... What economists do is they've got these 4 categories, sort of like 4 filing cabinet drawers, and what we do is we take all productive resources and put them in one or another of these 4 categories. The easiest one to understand is labor. That's just, hey, that's kind of what I'm doing right here, is I'm at work and I'm producing economic services. But labor is just human resources where a person does the work. When we say land, what we mean is natural resources, resources provided by nature. All the resources provided by nature, the fishes in the sea, the birds in the sky. We also mean soil, which is what most of us mean. When we say land, we think dirt. We mean that, but we also mean things like the water that nature provides and the air that nature provides. All of these things we put in the category of land, all natural resources. However, those natural resources are unaltered by humans. It's the way nature provides it. I just mentioned labor. Capital is another non-human resource. Capital is, and sometimes we say capital goods, capital is not human, but it's also not provided by nature. It's something that we have combined the land and labor, something provided by nature plus some effort to produce capital goods. And let me give you an example. We go out, we dig up some ground, dirt, whatever, and we get from that some iron ore, and then we put that in, I'm sort of in over my head here explaining the process of making iron, but it has to be smelted, is that the right word, and refined and so forth, get all the impurities out of there, and then we can go ahead and do some further refinement with it and turn it into steel. Well, steel then will be a capital good. That will be something where if you were, let's say, the manager of General Motors, and you're thinking, we need to produce some cars, and so what we're going to need in order to produce cars is we're going to need some steel. So you get on the phone and you call up a steel company, U.S. Steel or one of the others, and you say, hey, send over 10 tons of steel for us. We want to, and you order it in a certain package, certain form. But the point is that steel is going to be used in the production of cars. And so these resources, capital goods, are used to produce another good, but they themselves have been produced by people taking something provided by nature. Glass, same way. We take the sand, then put heat to it, and it turns into glass. And of course, there's a lot of other steps in between, but the idea is there of we take something provided by nature, the sand, and we take something else, the effort, and of course, there's heat applied, and that's where we get that capital good that we call glass. Entrepreneurship is another human resource. That's people. But that's not people coming in and just going to work and doing their best. And the entrepreneur is the person who does a lot of things. The entrepreneur is responsible for organizing the other resources. The entrepreneur is the one who says, gosh, if I had a radio station in Springfield, Missouri playing such and such a kind of music, there'd be a lot of people want to listen to it. This is a great idea. And so the entrepreneur perceives the market. Is there a market for this product? Designs the product. Goes out and hires resources. Oh, you want to go to work for me? I need to get, some land to set my building on. I need to put up a tower on it. The entrepreneur is making those decisions how to combine these resources, maybe in a different way than other people have combined them. The entrepreneur's got to go out and get financing in order to make this business and get started. And then the entrepreneur at the end pays all these other resources. Pay the rent, pay the employees' wages, pay for the materials that we've ordered, and then, of course, the entrepreneur sells that product. And after you sell the product, you get revenues back in. So the entrepreneur is the one that gets to keep all the money that's left over at the end. The entrepreneur is what I would call the residual claimant. Let me write that down. The entrepreneur is the residual claimant, the person who gets to claim what's left over at the end of the year. And what I mean by that is, if you sell $1 million worth of merchandise and your expenses, what you've paid the other resources, is $900,000, the residual that's just left over in the bank account at the end of the year is $100,000. That belongs to the entrepreneur. Now, it could very well have been the case that the entrepreneur goes out and spends $900,000 to hire these resources. The entrepreneur has a good produced, sells that good, and is disappointed there's not a big market there. And if there's not a big market, maybe the entrepreneur can only sell that merchandise for $800,000. Spent $900,000 in order to produce the goods, only gets back $800,000 in revenues, and now the residual claimant is claiming a negative amount. Now the entrepreneur says, wow, I've lost $100,000. That's the entrepreneur, and too bad. I'm not going to have a big celebration every time some entrepreneur gets rich. I'm not going to be feeling too bad if the entrepreneur gets poor, unless I'm the entrepreneur. This is a French word, this entrepreneur. It took me about, I would say, 10 years to learn how to spell it. We won't have a spelling contest this semester, so you won't have to be able to spell it, but you should recognize what this is. Sometimes we don't talk about the entrepreneur as a person so much as skills. Any of us can be an entrepreneur. All you have to have is the skills. I was, when I do my laundry at home, which is sort of the only place I do it actually, but I've got a washer and dryer there, but what I do is I put all the stuff in the washer, then when it gets done I throw it in the dryer, and then when it gets dry I just leave it there, and just pull stuff out of the dryer as the week goes along. And so I was kind of being entrepreneurial last night, and I thought, what I really need in here is I need a dryer with a light on inside, and so that way I just push a button, and then I'd be able to pull these socks and things like that out of here, T-shirts, whatever's in the dryer. Well, an entrepreneur probably was not going to be creating a dryer for me because the market's too small. But an entrepreneur is a person who goes out there and says, hey, here's a good idea. Here's another one of my ideas, blue salt. My problem with salt has always been you put it on your food and you can't see it. Did I get a lot of salt or not very much? And I always thought, if salt was blue, you'd sprinkle it out there and you say, yeah, that's about the right amount. Well, the entrepreneur, what do you think of that? Yeah, that would work, wouldn't it? Or maybe red. I don't know about red. I like the idea of blue. But I think there would be designer salts, though, once my idea catches on, and some people go for the green and other people go for red and so forth. I'm always going for the gold. But anyway, the idea is the entrepreneur is the one who's supposed to go out there and perceive these business opportunities. Here's a desire by consumers. They would be willing to spend money on it, and that desire is not currently being served. And the entrepreneur's job is to perceive those things, and then come up with, and the entrepreneur is going to go out and have to maybe hire an engineer or some kind of a marketing expert or whatever. I don't mean to say the entrepreneur does all this in his own head or her own head, but I do mean to say that that person's the one who takes the initiative, and then at the end of the year, that entrepreneur is the one who gets to claim whatever's left over or who loses whatever the amount is that's lost. If you go to work for an entrepreneur, you say, hey, I want to be paid, and they pay you, and then, if the entrepreneur gets rich, the entrepreneur is rich. But if they go broke, you still got paid. The employee's not the entrepreneur, it's the owner of the company, usually the owner of the company. And so these resources, and we will come back and talk about these resources over and over and over throughout the semester, but these resources are really something that nature requires us to have those resources if we want to produce goods and services. And I don't know what law of thermodynamics it is, so I'm not going to be telling you how nature requires this, but the point is that this is an absolute necessity. Now, here's the bad news, and there is some bad news in all this. These resources are limited. By the way, just stop me if I haven't explained something well enough or you want to hear a little bit more on the story. But until you stop me, I'm just going to keep talking. Resources are limited in quantity. How many workers do we have in the United States? What's the population of the United States? 260, 265 million people, I think. Let's put 265 million. Are all those people workers? Absolutely not. I do as little as possible. I've always considered that to be like a higher calling in life, is to get to the point where I do nothing. And I've been there many times. Anyway, so I went into teaching. There's not a great deal of effort in this. Once you study, there's a lot of effort in getting to this point. You've got to go to graduate school and study this stuff, and some people consider boring, not me, for several years. But once you do that, then after that, you just open your mouth and it comes out, and you can just keep opening your mouth. There's no limit to the number of times that this stuff will spew out, and they just keep sending the paychecks. So that's why I thought, take the job. Anyway, so we've got 265 million people. Obviously, there are children out there that are not going to work. We have child labor laws that restrict the amount of work a person can do until they reach, I think, 16 years old. I don't know a lot about child labor laws, but anyway, the point is a certain amount of our population is just sort of off limits. They're not going to be going to work. And there's some other people who, above a certain age, they are unlikely to work. There's no law that says you can't be a worker and in the labor force and so forth when you're 100 years old, but that's kind of an uncommon thing. Most people in the United States, I shouldn't say most people, but people tend to start retiring in the United States. Once they pass about 60, a certain percent of the population will retire, but others will keep on working. Of course, Social Security retirement kicks in for people today at 65, and so an increasing number of people will say, okay, I'm 65, I'll take my Social Security check and stop working. So as people get older, at each tail of the population, the very youngest and the very oldest people, they aren't working. There are some people, either men or women, who there's somebody else in the household who's fully employed, earning a decent living, and so it doesn't take everybody to be working in the household, so hey, I think I won't go to work. What was that movie that Michael Keaton, Mr. Mom? He stayed at home and managed the house and the kids and so forth, and what was his wife's name in that? Anyway, and I guess that would be Mrs. Mom. She went out in the labor force and supported the family. Right now we have about 130 to 135 million people with jobs. So it's about half of the population holds jobs and gets up and goes to work more or less every day. If we start talking about these things provided by nature, the soil and that stuff gets used up pretty rapidly. Now, there's a lot of soil or land, dirt out in, out in the western states, Idaho and Montana and Nevada and so forth. And those states, there are vast thousands of square miles just sitting idle. But, a lot of people don't want to live in the desert or out in the middle of the mountains and so forth. Maybe people want to, but they're not able to support themselves there. But there's a lot of this that is considered to be sort of an unproductive land. But don't forget what land includes. It also includes wildlife. It includes air and water. In certain cities, Los Angeles would be an example, they've used up about all the clean air they've got out there. It's kind of smoggy. And in certain areas, they've used up the clean water. They've sort of spoiled that by dumping pollution into it. There's for sure a limit. If there were no limit on clean air, then we wouldn't have to worry about pollution. We'd just say, who cares? Just put all this smoke you want to into the sky, because it will be whisked away to another planet, and we will just have all the clean air that we want right here in the United States. The world's not that way. We make that air dirty, and it's dirty. And some of it will blow away and go elsewhere, but a lot of cities are sort of built in areas where the wind doesn't blow away that rapidly, and so that clean air is very limited. Same thing with water. We've got lakes surrounding Springfield here. And, pollution is always something that is monitored, and try to keep that water pollution down to reasonable levels. Soil pollution, every once in a while you'll see these gas stations that have been abandoned around town. And, for a while, but now I think I know the answer, but for a long time I would drive by and see some little gas station. I think, why doesn't somebody just buy that and do something with it and start up a little business or whatever? Well, the answer is, in a lot of these older gas stations, not in the new ones so much, but in the older gas stations, what they have underground is these old tanks where they used to store gasoline and pump it out and put it in cars. And those old tanks that are underground, they rusted. And so now that old gasoline and all that was down in there, it's sort of seeped into the soil. And so that soil is not clean down underneath of that gas station that I'm saying, why doesn't somebody do something with that? That soil is not clean, it's polluted. And then the Environmental Protection Agency has got rules about that. Suppose I come along and I buy one of these old abandoned gas stations, and then somebody comes along, one of my neighbors, and does some sort of a soil test and says, oh, the ground's contaminated here. Then what they do is they get on the phone, they call up the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and they say, hey, get out here, we got some contaminated soil. So then they would come out there and do some more tests, and then what they would do is call me and say, hey, Tom, we want you to come on over here and talk about this property you own. And then I'd go over there, and then they would say, you've just got a terrible problem here, and you're going to have to solve this. And we think it'll cost you about $500,000. And since people are afraid of getting one of those bills, I had an uncle that got a bill like that. There was some people that the previous owner was burying barrels of old oil, contaminated oil. You know, after they do oil changes in a car, they take the old oil. And where do they store that? Well, we hope they don't do what they did to my uncle. This has been 10 or 15 years ago, but they went over and dug holes, put these old barrels in the ground. They covered the hole up and then forgot about it. And then a few years later, sell it to my uncle. And so then pollution started being noticed in the air, and the EPA comes out and does some tests, and they said, oh man, this is going to cost you over $1 million. Well, then he got a lawyer, and he sued the previous owner and was able to recover the situation from that. But anyway, that's why you see a lot of these old gas stations that nobody wants to use is, in addition to what you see above ground, you also are buying the stuff below ground, and you have responsibilities for that if you're the owner. And people don't want those responsibilities. The point is that even the soil that it just seems like it just goes on and on forever, but the amount of soil that is clean and so forth, there's a limit to that. So let me go back. We've got a limit on the amount of labor services, limited by the number of people. Of course, over time that can grow, but you know, you may not be aware of this. There are certainly some countries, and India comes to mind, but there are others. There are certain countries where the population is growing extremely rapidly, but in much of Europe and Japan, for example, but I think Spain, Italy, France, Japan, what we see is a situation where the population has stopped growing and is actually starting to contract. And they think that over the next 50 years in these countries that the population will be lower than it is today. And so in countries like that, it's not like the labor force is growing, it'll be shrinking. The amount of what nature provides us is limited. And since these two things put together, land and labor, is what produces capital goods, there's some limit to the amount of capital goods that we have. There's a limit imposed on the resources that we have available. And you know, this leads us to the idea of scarcity. So here's what we're dealing with, and I've sort of talked about these. Let me sort of bring them together here. We're dealing with a situation where people are self-interested. We talked about that earlier. They're self-interested. They want more. They're looking out for their own well-being. If you could just have any number of anything you want, would you just want to have one car? No, I think I'd like to have a car on nice days. I'd want a convertible. And on, let's say, days like this, maybe I want some kind of a four-wheel drive vehicle. And then for that neighbor down the street that I don't like, I want to get one of those Hummers, you know, it's a huge car, and just drive right over his car. And then there are other cars. I kind of like to have a sports car. And then when, you know, I go out to dinner with my parents and things like that, I like to have kind of a limousine-looking car. And then there's a few of these old cars that I like, you know, sort of classics. That'd be maybe a 1953 Corvette or something like this. Yeah, I'd like to have 10 or 15 cars. Houses, I'd like to have one. Well, Springfield would be a wonderful place to have a house. Hey, I do have a house in Springfield. But, you know, it'd be nice to have an apartment in New York City to travel there a few times a year and kind of see the Christmas trees being lit in the fall, fall or winter. It'd be kind of nice to be there in the spring maybe for a while. I'd like to have a house in Jamaica down on the beach, but another one up in the mountains. Be nice to have something out on the East Coast, maybe North Carolina someplace. What's the limit on these things? I mean, if you could just have anything you want, have you ever asked yourself that? If I'm Bill Gates, and I got all the money in the world, what would I have? And the answer is everything. TV set in every room, radio in every room, watch on every arm, maybe one on my ankle. Hey, what time is it? 4:15. Houses, cars, I mean, you name it. Parties. You guys want to go to a party? We have one every night. Well, that's not true, but I'm saying if I were Bill Gates, I would say that. If I were Bill Gates, what would I do? I'd quit my job and become a college teacher. For sure. So let me go back. Humans want to make themselves better off, want to feel better, have a better day, whatever. And so we have this unlimited desire for things, just unlimited. More clothes, yeah, I like to wear, just new clothes every day, and just after I've worn them once, that'll be the end of it. New shoes. So humans have these unlimited desires, but we have limited resources. And since we want more than we can actually produce, and that's really where I'm building up here, the fact that we want more than we can actually produce, that's what scarcity means. Scarcity means is that the desires of people outstrip or exceed the resources available to produce goods and services. That's what we mean by scarcity. I don't mean by scarcity, it's a shortage. You go to the store and they don't have eggs, so there's a scarcity of eggs. I don't mean that. That would be a shortage of eggs. But what I mean by this is just scarcity is this all-pervasive situation that people in this country and people in China and people in Mexico and every place that you go, we as individuals or we as a society, we confront this idea of scarcity. We want more than is possible to produce, possible to have. What's the implication of that? The implication is this. If you want more than you can have, you have to choose. You have to decide, I want this rather than that. I want them both. I do want that, that limousine, and I do want that convertible, but since I can't afford both, I'm going to have to choose. Do I want the limousine or the convertible more? Or would I rather not have the limousine or the convertible and buy a house? Or could I afford to get by in a little bit smaller house and buy some clothes? And we all face that situation. We are constrained by these resources available to us on what we can produce, and we want more than we can produce, so we have to choose what's the most important thing to us. Let me sort of close with this one concept. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And by the way, there's an acronym that goes along with this. TANSTAAFL. TANSTAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. No matter what it is, if you want something, you've got to give up something else to get it. And of course, lunch is just kind of a silly idea, but there's no such thing as a free car, there's no such thing as a free suit, there's no such thing as a free house. In order to get anything, you have to give up something else, and that is imposed on us by this condition of scarcity that everyone faces. And it's scarcity, really, that creates the field of economics. If there were no scarcity, we wouldn't have to choose between things. We wouldn't have to go out here and work hard and so forth. If there were no scarcity, we could have everything we want without giving anything up. But we do face scarcity. We do have this no such thing as a free lunch.